Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this first in our series of events under the signed agreement between the University of the West Indies and the United States Embassy in Barbados, signaling the start of our joint initiative on US-CARICOM trade and investment relations. We have been generously provided with funding to launch a series of activities encompassing university exchanges between the University of the West Indies and universities in the US, research, opportunities for our students, as well as webinars just like this one, which we hope will cumulatively help to spearhead the thinking for the region on how to advance the economic component of US-CARICOM relations. Yes, we know there's a lot of other activity out there that marks the relationship between the Caribbean and one of our oldest partners, North America. But this initiative is not trying to focus on all and every area. We are squarely concerned with advancing those types of initiatives that are aimed at growing, enhancing, furthering, deepening, and widening opportunities for economic and transformational growth of our CARICOM economies. It is also the last of our Shridath Ramphal Center events for the year. And what a year it has been. Despite the continuation of the pandemic, we at the center have soldiered on. We have, among other things, launched 3 short courses, Women and Trade in the Americas under a WTO Chairs program, 2 courses with the OECS on competition law, as well as the CCJ law, which will happen in January. We have churned out a total of 3 SRC policy briefs on areas such as food security for CARICOM, financing of the Sustainable Development Goals by CARICOM countries, and the interface between trade and climate change and implications for CARICOM. We have also established and formalized relations with partners like the US Embassy and others. And the future in 2022 promises to be even brighter. What we have learned over the year is that engagement goes hand in hand with research. Research must live in a real world setting and must bring forth new ideas for shaping the environment in which Caribbean states operate and must thrive, which is why we are so pleased to start this engagement on CARICOM-US relations. This series is the start of what we hope will be a seismic shift in the way we think about our relationship with the US. And we want, through this webinar, to start with some of the basics by looking at what has already characterized the relationship with the US in trade and investment, but also by looking more closely at who in the United States institutional architecture we have been engaging with. As I hope you will learn, there are a multitude of entities with which CARICOM states, NGOs, private sector participants engage on a daily basis, and in some cases, not nearly enough basis with our US counterparts. While there seems to be a lot of activity with the region recently, most notably, you would have heard about the summit held a few days ago. We've also heard about the vaccine supplies being provided by the United States, CBI, correspondent banking relationships. The question that I pose is, what in the field of trade and investment has actually stuck? What characterizes the relationship in the past? And what can we reasonably and hopefully look forward to in the future? I have a stellar cast of panelists to discuss these issues. And we will do so in a format that will guide all of the 3 webinars under this initiative. There will be a background paper that will be presented by an expert, followed by commentary by an experienced and thoughtful slate of panel members. The background paper for this webinar has been drafted by Mr. Stephen Lande, and he will present his main conclusions. That paper will be made available on the SRC website soon after this discussion. Our discussants are Ambassadors Patrick Duddy and Anton Edmunds, as well as Jason Marczak, all of whom I will introduce during this webinar. Before I go into any more details about the content of our webinar, let me ask my fellow collaborators on this event to welcome you as well with their own words. I'm first going to ask the Ambassador Linda Tagliatella of the United States Embassy to start her remarks. That ambassador was sworn in 2016 as the United States Ambassador for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, and the United States representative to the OECS. During her tenure, she has forged strong bilateral and regional partnerships focusing on creating a safe and more secure region, promoting sustainable economic growth, and building capacity to plan for and respond to natural disasters, and advocating on human rights and equalities of opportunities. Ambassador, the floor is yours to give a few welcome remarks.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you for today's webinar. I want to thank the Shridath Ramphal Center and the University of West Indies for hosting this morning. Thank you, Jan, for bringing us all together in this virtual place for the webinar. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces as the part of the program. We have all worked and continue to work to advance the prosperity of the Caribbean and the US-CARICOM relationship. I want to offer a few words as we start this series on US-CARICOM trade and investment relations. Everyone joining us today is aware of the immense and important relationship between the United States and the Caribbean. I've spent my last week at airports around the region welcoming US carriers, United and American Airlines, which have expanded services to Barbados and Dominica. But beyond those very visible bridges, billions of dollars flow between the United States and the Caribbean every year in goods and services. Mechanisms like the Caribbean Basin Initiative have helped enrich and expand our trade and investment relationships for more than 2 decades now. More recent programs have successfully facilitated the economic development and export diversification of Caribbean economies. Today's seminar begins a series that advances our understanding of the dynamics of this relationship. Beyond government aid and remittances, how do our governments and economies work together? How are the United States Congress, the United States Trade Representative, and the private sector involved? I look forward to the conversations today to answer these questions, and I invite all of you joining virtually to participate in the discussion. Here at the Embassy in Barbados, we are committed to supporting the trade and investment relationship, from the youngest startup that seeks to expand to the United States market to the largest energy firm that's looking for new ways to power and empower communities. We're happy that programs like this and our partnership with the UE help us to deepen these relationships. Thank you all again, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to join you for this webinar. I want to thank the University of West Indies for hosting this morning, and I want to say thank you all, and I wish you all a good webinar.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That might have been my thing that you heard, not yours. It was on my end. But thank you so much for outlining the ways that the United States and the Caribbean, especially CARICOM, which is the focus of our webinar, benefits from that bilateral relationship in trade and investment. I'm now going to ask Mr. David Lewis. He is our collaborator as well, has helped with the planning and our execution of this webinar, to say a few words. And as he turns on his mic, Dr. David Lewis is no stranger to the CARICOM communities, an international trade and investment expert with 35 years of experience in public and private sector positions advancing US-CARICOM trade and investment initiatives. He is a multinational Caribbean man. He's based in Washington, D.C., where he is a founding fellow and co-chair of the Caribbean Policy Consortium, the CPC, in which capacity he's present today. And since 2001, he's been the Vice President of Manchester Trade. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Genevieve. Colleagues, good morning all on the panel and virtually across the US, the Caribbean, and internationally. Ambassador Tagliatella, good to see you again. And as I always tell people, timing is critical in business. It was about almost over 3 years ago, you hosted me at your office at the embassy, and your key point question was, what can we do to strengthen ties with the islands in various business, trade, and investment initiatives? So it took us a while, but I took you up on that request or directive. My fellow Puerto Rican Joaquin Monserrate was there with you. I know you now have a new team, which is equally as prepared and committed. And when Genevieve came to us and indicated the embassy was willing to support this program, I really told her, excellent, you've got a great partnership there, and we thank you very much. So good to connect with you and your team again. And hopefully next year we'll all do the same, but in Barbados this time. Genevieve, Ambassador Duddy, Ambassador Edmunds, Jason, and Stephen. I'd just like to point a few pointers as reminders of where we are, and of course then pass on to you all, who's the main show. I think first and foremost, Stephen's involvement in the design and implementation of the Caribbean Basin Initiative almost 40 years ago. And I was privileged about a decade later to actually be involved in the execution and implementation of CBI trade and investment promotion throughout the region, similarly to Ambassador Edmunds. So we're bringing together some generational and multinational expertise and experience, which I think is critical. And in terms of looking to see ways that we can leverage and traction the toolkits that exist in the US government for the promotion and advancement of trade and investment between the US and the CARICOM markets, both in terms of government policy, regulatory initiatives, but finally, really the most important part is, what is the impact in terms of actual business activities that can result in the bottom line that almost all, if not all, of our prime ministers and presidents look to, which is more and better jobs and economic growth and prosperity in the region. A key aspect of this is clearly going to be beyond the Caribbean Basin Initiative and its focus on goods and manufacturing, and the fact that we have a region in CARICOM that on average is 70% services. The WTO just came out with a recent report on how services remains the main driver in the global economy and will be the main driver in the post-COVID recovery and reconstruction. I see that as a plus and an asset for the CARICOM economies, and the opportunity to look for ways to leverage that in terms of economic growth. With that, one of the key tools that has been a pet example of mine is the Trade and Investment Council between the US and CARICOM. It will be discussed today, and it will actually be the focus of our second webinar next year in the spring. And also initiatives which are taking place, as many of us have seen, on utilizing nearshoring foreign direct investment opportunities throughout the region, some of which are already taken hold. But finally, I think the key timing part is we also have a new leadership team in the CARICOM Community Secretariat, a new Secretary General, new initiatives with regards to the work on foreign relations and trade negotiations. And I couldn't think of a better time with the new efforts of the Biden administration, where both the US and CARICOM partners at the government, business, civil society, think tank levels can really come together and use next year to jumpstart that issue, leverage the past, and focus on the future. So thank you all for joining us. The Caribbean Policy Consortium is pleased to be invited by SRC to join this. I'm a fellow UWI grad, although not from Barbados, from Jamaica. And I really look forward to this and the next series next year. Thank you so much, Genevieve.
And thank you so much, David, for your continued collaboration with us on this project. So turning now to the main event, squarely to the panel discussion. We will start with the main speaker, who will speak for about 15 minutes and present his ideas on the topic. And we look forward to Stephen's presentation because he's given quite a bit of thought to it. After he gives his 15-minute presentation, I will invite the commentators on the panel to give their reactions for a maximum of 10 minutes each. We will then have a small roundtable discussion in which David will jump in to give his opinions on some of the things that were said and stoke the discussion a little bit so that it is dynamic and interactive. After that, we will turn to you, the audience, and address any of the questions that you may raise in the course of the discussion. And in this regard, I invite you throughout the duration of the speaker's interventions to write any comments or questions you have in the dedicated Q&A portion of the tabs below that will be available to you on your screen. So feel free, please, to give your thoughts as we go through the webinar. So without further ado, let me start by introducing our main speaker, Mr. Stephen Lande, president of the Manchester Trade Outfit. He's a distinguished international trade expert in the United States and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He has served in the office of the USTR as the senior trade negotiator, and he has worked in Africa, Asia, Latin America throughout his time. And I think, as David mentioned, he has been dubbed the father of the CBI. So without further ado, let us allow Stephen to give his initial 15-minute presentation, after which I will introduce the other speakers. Over to you, Stephen.
Well, anyway, it's a pleasure to think back 40 years ago and to go back in history. So it's good to have to refresh my memory. One of the comments I will make right up front, I was surprised how little had changed, because when I was looking at some old notes I made and then looking at some of the emails I got concerning the presentation, I said, hey, we had the same discussion. I remember back at that point in time discussing services and how do we include it and what do we do with it and so on, etc. So one, I thank you for the ability to reminisce. I feel a little bit like the History Channel and so on. Two, I know you did not mean this, Dr. Remy, but by talking about me being the father of the CBI causes me nothing but problems. I am happily, or maybe not happily, I'm not sure, married for 57 years. And every time somebody says that, my wife looks at me and said, who the hell was the mother of the CBI if you were the father? And then I have to go a step farther and say Immaculate Conception, but she says, being Jewish, I can't get away with that. So let me say that that I was not the father of the CBI. It came from a lot of deep thinking people and a lot of Caribbean people as well, and so on. As far as this talk goes, I owe a lot to George Florio. George Florio has been at CSIS for a number of years, turns out a lot of papers, one of the real thinkers in terms of political relationships with Latin America, including the Caribbean. And back in 2018-19, he wrote a paper which he called, What About CBI 2.0? You may recall at that time, the President Trump was talking about renegotiating NAFTA, actually talking about dumping NAFTA. Fortunately, he renegotiated it. And the expression we were using, what about NAFTA 2.0? So his theory was, why don't we go back to CBI and maybe think about 2.0? It's an idea that was discussed, didn't go very far. But all of a sudden, there was this very significant event, an event, by the way, which has been undercovered. I think its significance will only become apparent over the next year or so. But that was the decision of President Biden, perhaps dating back to Jimmy Carter, to bring back human rights, democracy back into the administration as a major determinant of policy. And for those who happen to follow the news, unfortunately, once again, Trump news in the US and January 6th and the hearings seem to overshadow this particular news and so on, etc. But the fact of the matter was that Mr. Biden hosted a virtual meeting of about 110, if I'm not mistaken, world leaders focusing on democracy. And guess what region had the most representation if you compare it to the potential size? There was no region other than the CARICOM, or what I call core CARICOM, and so on, who had every single chief of state and so on from an independent country was invited to that meeting. I don't include Haiti in the list because it kind of joined a little bit later, it has a different history, and obviously they have unique problems. But no other region can brag that, not even Europe, because Hungary did not get invited and so on among the countries that could have. This is unbelievable, because if your strength, and it really is a commitment to democratic principles, automatic opposition to authoritarianism, a strong believer in human rights, on the verge of fighting corruption, and so on, that if particularly the two, if they are going to be the guiding principles of this administration, there is no better ally for the United States than CBI. I'm sure than the CARICOM. The reason we have CBI was not because of anything I did or anyone else did. It was because Prime Minister Siaga happened to be among, if not the first visitor to the White House and so on, back when President Reagan became president. That's why I always say the history of CBI is more than 40 years and so on, etc. And at that meeting, Mr. Siaga said, hey, I need a Marshall Plan. I need help. I've just had a tough fight with Michael Manley, all kinds of debates. Was he leftist? Was he a friend of Castro? I obviously don't want to go there because I asked David Lewis for all interpretations of what goes on in the Caribbean. But I do know that this was of concern to this administration. And Siaga says, I need help fighting. I need help in terms of establishing a position in Jamaica, which at that moment was not doing that well economically. Mr. Reagan then met with his NSC groups and said, what can we do? And they said, no, Marshall Plan, money, we don't want to do money. We give enough away. The normal reaction to anybody who asks for money is to put your hand in the other pocket and go as deep as possible with it. But he said, what else can we do? And we had just finished implementing the GSP system, or maybe we had done it about 5-6 years ago. So somehow the idea of why not give them trade preferences? And since those who know about trade preferences, they know the first preferential agreement the US came up with the generalized system of preferences, which covered all developing countries, India and so on, Brazil, the weather level. But because of import sensitivity, many of the labor-intensive products were left off, and some of the more important agricultural products, which happen to be growing in the tropics, but if they also were growing in the temperate climate, or they competed against products growing in temperate agriculture, meaning in the US, even if they were given duty-free treatment, they were still subject to quotas in those days. So those were kind of excluded. So the approach was, what can we do in order to improve the benefits? When you come up with any policy that provides special treatment for a particular region, you're not going to get it through unless you have the White House support, because the other regional agencies, the local groups that are used to things are just simply going to dominate it. But we did have the support of the White House and so on. Went to Bill Brock, who was the USTR at those days, Bob Hormats, who was the deputy really in charge of operations and so on. And between the two, we got our CBI launched very well, and we succeeded in getting it passed and so on. The beauty of the Democratic initiative of Mr. Biden is that now we have a basis for an approach by the Caribbean, if they wish to make it, and say, okay, let's work together. I read very closely the speech by the Guyanese president. I don't know if any of the other leaders spoke, but the only speech I was able to say at the summit was the speech by the Guyanese president. And he echoed as much. He didn't say CBI. But what he did say was, we have made progress in our own country in assuring and protecting democracy. The Caribbean is, and CARICOM particularly, is a hotbed of democracy. It's a basic win. We view our obligation to be an example, to reach out to other areas of the world and see what we can do. So I said, God, if we could sell this idea that there are various issues which have been lingering for many years that interferes with economic growth within the Caribbean and so on. And if we can come up with solutions to some of those problems, perhaps in the CBI type initiative, because we have the White House involvement, so they can knock their heads together in the US sufficiently to make progress. Why don't we think of that? And we have a year, because those who followed the summit, the basic agreement was, and it was agreement, it was said by President Biden, but people will come, he said, let's get together in another year and let's come up with practical plans in which we can show how are we going to explain the advantages of a democratic approach. So we now have created for us the dates. Dr. Remy, you cannot have better dates. This meeting was actually over last Wednesday, so you talk about something. So I don't know the details of the meeting. I don't know what people are thinking, but I do know that if you get a group of people who have ideas and they begin talking about it, you can sell them to the CARICOM. I heard what David said about new leadership, which could be crucial. You can sell them to this administration. Many of us have friends who are in this administration and do it. So when people would discuss, and I received a lot of benefit from the other panelists during that, so what do we have, an hour and 20-minute discussion, which is supposed to be 10 minutes before the presentation, and you guys and ladies kept talking about drivers. I said, okay, well, the driver actually is going to be us, not us, but a group of people who possibly can work and put these ideas together. So that's kind of the framework. And somehow I wish it was somewhat in a different order, because I'd love to hear from the private sector, which you're going to cover later on, as to what their problems are. There were two ways you approach a problem. One way, which is very well advocated by my partner, David Lewis, and we did talk about it for about 2 hours last night, is there are established mechanisms that are in place. And maybe if we use those mechanisms better, particularly the TIC, particularly some of the investment groups around, maybe that's enough to have this kind of revitalization. And fortunately, the ambassador on the panel will explain in a little more detail exactly what we're doing in each of the groups, but I knew you wanted to cover that and so on, and what the existing facilities are. To me, there are 4 areas where we may want to think of legislation or other kinds of change. First, even though we have been able to convince the US IFDC, the large US investment development bank, which is designed to challenge China in terms of providing finance for the US private sector and so on. And we've been able to at least have them say initially they're not going to focus their assistance only on least developed countries and so on, but they'll be more general. There is still the feeling that economic assistance, promotion of investment, particularly in infrastructure, is aimed at more advanced countries. I argue that if we approach the White House, if the Caribbean cares about it enough, we should be able to include as a priority support of democracy in terms of US aid funds, and stop having the Caribbean go to the back of the line because it happens to have a high per capita income, but people forget about the problems of small, island, vulnerable states in terms of location, transportation, susceptibility to natural disasters, and so on, the problem of economic diversification. So that's kind of my first proposal, to focus on US assistance, work together, and focus very much on it. The second issue, which is a long discussion, obviously, is services. We have yet not figured out the mechanism by which we can mobilize services investments in the Caribbean to come from the US. My view is that the US, even though it does not like to admit it, I'm going a little bit longer, but give me another 3 minutes, okay? But I know you like your time. Anyway, but even though the US has a lot of obstacles. One, for example, which is very obvious, is that one of the comparative advantage, given the education level, given the climate, given the location, is in medical tourism. It's something which, medical tourism, you can go and get it done. Unfortunately, most people who go on medical tourism are people who rely on medical benefits under Medicare and under US insurance programs. And that funds cannot be used for overseas work. Well, if you really want to move beyond where you are now, you have to go back and consider whether or not there's a lot of justifications for changing the US rules. I think there is. I can make the arguments. I don't want to do them now. We can discuss it later. But that's an example. My view would be the CBI initiative was great. Unfortunately, it focused on trade policy, which unfortunately labor-intensive manufacturing, agriculture were not areas which really lent themselves to use in the Caribbean. Davis figure of 70%. But this CBI should be, CBI 2.0 should be focused on issues of issue to the Caribbean. The third quick area, which I would definitely look at, is this discussion of money laundering. Way over my head, Ambassador Sanders writes great articles, and if anybody has been educating me, it has been him. But the problem of the world is that US corresponding banks are under a lot of limitations when it comes to the Caribbean, because the Caribbean banks have to prove themselves responsible for, quote, have to prove themselves responsible for know thy customer, for anything a customer does, and it's hard to control that. As you know, some of the more established banking communities like Jamaica doesn't have problems. Some of the other ones, Belize recently had a problem. All I would ask for is a careful study to make sure that the US laws do not are put in a position where they can take advantage of the Caribbean location and structure, and we don't punish the Caribbean by being too strict. This has already been discussed, but whether or not it involves legislative changes or not, I'm not sure. My fourth point is diaspora. This is something everybody talks about. No one yet has figured out how to mobilize. I have not figured out how to mobilize it, but it should be. But I do know when it comes to my diaspora, meaning the Jewish Israeli diaspora, that's organized. I mean, it's ready to go. Thank God you don't have an Adolf Hitler to help organize you, so I'm not wishing you that. But what I am saying is that if I had to focus on something new, let's put the money in, let's put the thoughts into getting the successful diaspora in the US, which are both individual investments, but also the fact that many of the multinationals, many of those areas that are involved are very much, how should I say, they have a lot of influence in terms of where investment goes. One of the major jobs that US aid can do, and one of the big lacks, is what I always call the lack of investment-ready projects. You know, where you do that study, you have it finished, you have a official impetus to justify the figures, the profit potentials, working between the diaspora community, SMEs in the Caribbean, focusing on getting all those projects, I think is how to do it. Let me stop now. There are obviously other things to include, but again, to make the point, in short, let's think of using the democracy initiative as a cover for another CBI initiative. Reach out to the Caribbean caucus in the Congress. You have a very unique resource in the ambassadors in Washington, the CBI ambassador group. Mr. Edmunds can chat, but they have been, Ambassador Edmunds can chat, but they have been very effective in Washington when they are given an objective and a particular thing to do. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it very much. And I look forward not only to a vivid question and answer period, but I also look forward to the future seminars where the private sector can let us know the key question. Should we focus on what we have now and use it better, or do we need something new? And if it's something we need new, what do we need in the relationship? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And we really look forward to that paper that kind of brings all of these wonderful thoughts you have together. And as I mentioned, that will be made available on our SRC website in the coming days. So thank you for that. So we have a lot of food for thought. Repurpose CBI, tacking it on to this new Summit of the Americas and Democratic Summit that's happened. Is this the opportunity to try to bring on some of these newer issues onto an older infrastructure? We're going to talk now with Ambassador Patrick Duddy, who has served as the U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela for both President Bush and Obama. Before his assignment in Caracas, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, and now in his retired life from diplomatic service, he is Director of the Center for Latin America and Caribbean Studies at Duke University, one of my alma maters as well. Oh, Ambassador Duddy, I wonder if, in addition to what Stephen said, you can start tacking on initiatives to the entities in U.S. government that have been in the past responsible for some of these initiatives and engagements in CARICOM, as well as respond to Stephen's ideas. Over to you, Ambassador.
Well, good morning to everyone, and thank you very much, John. I'd like to congratulate the university, the Caribbean Policy Consortium, and the U.S. Embassy in Barbados for bringing this initiative to life. I think it is extremely timely, and clearly it is timely from 2 points of view. We have a new administration in Washington. There's new leadership in CARICOM. but also we are at a juncture in which it seems to me there is considerable agreement that efforts are needed to renew and extend the CBI, but also to help the Caribbean region recover from the pandemic. I'm going to share my screen, incidentally, and talk through what I hope will be some rather basic points on the elements of the U.S. government currently involved in Caribbean engagement. As a preamble, just to make a couple of points, I want to stress that it's that the U.S. government is not monolithic. I think that's a good place to start. There are many agencies and departments engaged in the Caribbean. We are not monolithic any more than CARICOM is monolithic. A second observation, U.S. foreign policy changes typically only incrementally, slowly. As Stephen's opening remarks make clear, there are elements of U.S. government policy toward the region, which were in fact first articulated nearly 40 years ago. I remember vividly because I was in the Caribbean as we were beginning to implement the CBI in the early 80s. I do subscribe to the notion that it is time to pursue renewal and expansion of the CBI. I note, again, Stephen made reference to this, that a part of the justification for renegotiating NAFTA was that there were entire categories of commerce which were simply not relevant, didn't exist, if you will, when NAFTA was first negotiated. And so the agreement had to be effectively modernized. Now, a third point, the Biden administration has not yet fully articulated a new policy toward the region. So the many elements of the Caribbean Basin Initiative continue to be relevant and indeed establish our, if you will, right and left margins for future negotiations. Now, that being said, post-pandemic recovery is and I think will be a priority both for the region and for the United States. And I note that I think as of last August, the US government had committed to donating more than 5 million vaccines to the region and more than 3 million ancillary kits necessary for the administration of the vaccine. This is a very significant donation, but it effectively shows the way out of the medical crisis, or at least in diminishing it, the economic recovery is going to need to be much more ambitious and multifaceted. There are some initiatives that are already in train. I know that the Department of Commerce is already organizing a major trade mission for October in 2022, which will take place in Miami and give the countries of the region and the American private sector a forum for coming together to consider opportunities. So some very, if you will, basic considerations. When I say that the US government is not monolithic, at least a part of what I'm hoping to convey is that as CARICOM, and for that matter, US private sector groups pursue engagement, it is going to be important to understand who's doing what and who's responsible for what. Now, the US Department of State, typically through the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs and the embassy in Barbados, will be crucial for the implementation of any new programs or initiatives. The State Department effectively becomes a partner to the other agencies of the U.S. government and guides them as they attempt to target opportunities or if you will, areas that require urgent attention. Commerce, and this is a key point, the Department of Commerce has as its goal to increase trade to the benefit of the United States. But it is understood within the Department of Commerce that this typically has to be a two-way street. Now, if I remember correctly, aggregate commerce with CARICOM is in the vicinity of $35 billion. And the US presently enjoys a trade surplus with CARICOM of about $12 billion, or at least with the Caribbean. This is significant and should be understood, just as the political stability of the sub-region and its embrace of democracy. This should be a source of leverage with the US government, right? CARICOM, again, to echo Stephen's point, is an ideal partner. Right? It has a private sector, it is democratic, it understands the importance of the rule of law and respect for human rights. Commerce typically strives to increase trade, but can also be an important agent for trade with the United States, or the sale of US goods abroad, but can also be a critical agent for encouraging trade in the aggregate. The US International Development Finance Corporation, which others may remember as OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, is intended not only to provide financing, but also and often feasibility studies. Tremendously important for the future is that working through the International Development Finance Corporation, countries can highlight the feasibility of investment, the feasibility of projects on the ground in the Caribbean. The US Export-Import Bank provides financing for US entities, but as the region engages with the US private sector, it is important to be aware of what the Export-Import Bank can offer by way of assistance. The US Agency for International Development is the development arm of the US foreign affairs community. Over the years, I believe, certainly since 2010, they've administered over $600 million in assistance to the region, and they now have a regional development cooperation strategy, which particularly emphasizes two regional development objectives, one being government accountability and transparency, and the other community resilience. The first of those involves—
I hate to interrupt, but I'm just gonna ask to wind down a little bit because we have,
Right. The first of those development objectives involves a range of US government entities, including agencies like Homeland Security, the Southern Command, but also USAID, the State Department, the US Trade Representative's Office. As we go forward, just to end on this particular note, it is also significant that neither the Department of State nor the embassy negotiates new trade agreements. That is the U.S. Trade Representative's function. So very briefly, the U.S. Department of State, the Department of Commerce, U.S. Agency for International Development, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office are all key players for engagement in the region and will be central to any effort to negotiate an extension or expansion of the Caribbean Basin Initiative.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think you had a second slide. I wonder if you can just show
I
it.
will. I do.
Just so that persons can see
What-
the whole.
I also simply note that counter-narcotics operations are tremendously important. Disaster preparedness, which of course would involve the DEA, disaster preparedness is something that concerns the Coast Guard, the U.S. Department of Defense, as well as Homeland Security. And we can return to some of those if there are specific questions.
I think it's really useful to have that because what it demonstrates and very nicely ties into the title of this webinar is the multiplicity of agencies in the United States government responsible for relations, including relations with CARICOM, that would be really important to map out as we forge ahead in a very deliberate way what a US CARICOM policy in the future might be. That's excellent. Thank you very much for your remarks. I'm going to turn over now to Ambassador Anton Edmunds, who has served as Ambassador of St. Lucia to the United States and the Permanent Representative of St. Lucia to the OAS. He's also St. Lucia's High Commissioner to Canada and Ambassador non-resident to Mexico. Prior to taking up that appointment, Ambassador worked in the private sector, providing advisory services to business associations and associations with interests in the Caribbean region. Ambassador, over to you to provide your perspectives from a slightly different angle, looking at the engagement of CARICOM ambassadors with this huge U.S. machinery, especially in Washington, D.C., where you are based. Thanks for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jan. I want to start off with a positive, which is that there's been success. I mean, and the caucus of Caribbean CARICOM ambassadors has been actively engaged, for example, in a variety of initiatives, including the passage of CBTPA, the extension in 2020. But that said, one of the key elements that we end up being responsible for is responding to a directive from our governments and a directive from the collective, which is CARICOM. So in as much as we're embedded in the space and we have access to the space and we can succeed in it in terms of advancing regional interests, the driver has to come from the region. I want to pivot just a little bit and sort of focus on, or at least comment on a couple of things stated prior. Dr. Lewis talked about the service economy being recognized as a growth and competitive area, creative industries and others and nearshoring as opportunities for the region. And this is sort of going to be a reoccurring theme, at least in my intervention, is whether the region is ready to advocate and advance its own interests in the space. And I'm not sure that we're there yet. In as much as Steve has laid out an argument for the US to engage the region, the question in Washington is always one of the driver, for the most part, being the region's interests. And when I say region, I'm not just talking about our CARICOM region, but Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere. The fundamentals are clear. Time is short. New administrations have very brief windows to focus. We continue to compete for attention globally. There's a learning curve in Washington that we cannot overlook in terms of individuals within the agencies that the region has to educate. So Ambassador Duddy laid out all of these entities that are critically important, but it is going to be up to us as the region to enter those agencies and educate them as it relates to our needs. If we don't, then they're going to be well-intentioned and they're going to try to create initiatives on our behalf, but sometimes that doesn't quite jive. When we talk about a CBI 2, The enabling environment is something that I worry about, or in other words, there are other initiatives that are in place that we also need to nurture while we aspire for this umbrella kind of framework. Fundamentally, of course, security, resilience, access to capital, but there's a sense of urgency that once again, we have to exhibit. There is competition in the region, which we acknowledge as a region, and which is something the United States is aware of. Sometimes from some in Washington, the competition for sort of attention from us and investment funds to us at times may not be considered to be friends of the United States. This is not a critique of the region and of what countries in the region bilaterally do on behalf of their own countries. But it also highlights the fact that legislation and advancing on legislation is driven by Congress in many respects. At the end of the day, or at least Congress is the entity. It's not the administration, is the entity that has to pass this legislation. And Congress is the place where we have to spend a fair amount of time educating folks as to what our needs are and what the opportunities are. Congress is largely unaware of our region. Ultimately, congressional representatives focus on their own districts, and in as much as they have interests externally, it is going to be up to us to effectively engage them as to our needs so that the right kind of legislation can be crafted. To Ambassador Duddy's point, even as you have this sort of wide swath of agencies, within those agencies, there are sub-units or sub-departments that can be very positively engaged. But once again, one has to go into that space and find them. For example, when you talk about energy and renewable energy and that sort of space, within the Department of Energy, you have the National Renewable Energy Labs, which is sort of the technical arm of that entity that ends up providing the technical advice or service or support to us in the region. So there's a fair amount of digging that we have to be ready to do within all of these agencies to find the right unit with those agencies. And of course, we also have to be advocates for the interagency process that Ambassador Duddy alluded to, but that has to be stood up and managed. So it's the state and it's the other entity. There's also the NSC. So there are a lot of moving parts that we need to educate ourselves as to their presence and our engagement. And in some respects, I use the word, and I don't mean it a negative, but we've been spoiled in the sense that we've been the recipient of initiatives driven at times from Washington. And as a result, once again, not always ideal, but driven from Washington. So we have not had to navigate those entities. But if we want to drive the process, we're going to have to navigate these entities and understand what they do and how we can plug and play them into our system. The driver, once again, is the main item that I think we can't ignore. Is the region going to be the driver, or is it the expectation that someone in Washington will drive the process on our behalf? In as much as democracy and what Steve alluded to, what Steve mentioned, and the Summit of the Americas coming up next year may very well be opportunities. Once again, timing is very, very short. One initiative that I just want to sort of point out, which came out of engagement by many in Washington, was the US-Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act of 2016. Here was an initiative that the first, I think, major piece of legislation since CBI for the Caribbean. However, it was a piece of legislation which was passed, but ultimately it was underfunded. And it is an area where we as a region recognize that there's a piece of legislation there, but we have been unable to attach the resources to it, which means, once again, going to the Congress as well as working the administration to make sure that a piece of legislation has funding behind it. So CBI 2 as a theoretical construct or as an umbrella construct is important, but we also have to understand that we need to be the one building the pillars upon which it stands, which includes resources. I'm just going to close with a final point. We have a midterm election in right around the corner. And we've lost a fair amount of time. And obviously the things going on around the world, which basically always shifts the US's attention away from our region because we're largely stable. So the opportunity is now for us to engage effectively, support the initiatives that are already in place while we aspire or plan for this broader trade and investment initiative that we would like to see created. Thank you.
Ambassador, you kept the time and you covered so much ground. It's really fascinating what your perspective is, being on the ground, but also having your background with working with private sector interests, understanding, how to navigate that space. And I'd love to hear in the Q&A what some of the wins are, that where have we been effective in driving that strategy? Your refrain of the drive of the region has been spoiled in a sense, because maybe a lot of the initiatives have come from the US that have not necessarily emanated from the bottom up. So the question is, what are the easy wins? How do we merge that into a broader framework proposed by Stephen, but also others? The strategic engagement you mentioned is also another one that we can reinvigorate and refund. So these are really great things to discuss, and I look forward to the Q&A. Last but by no means least, we have Jason Marczak, who is director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Ash Latin America Center. He joined the council in 2013, and under his leadership, the Latin America Center is a regular venue for heads of state and cabinet level officials. And very happy for us, in 2021, he led the establishment now of the Caribbean Initiative. So from the perspective that he brings, I'm really hopeful that we're going to tie a lot of these thoughts together, given his, his very strident leadership of the center in looking at how the Caribbean fits into the broader program of Latin America and US engagement. So over to you, Jason. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you so much. First off, just thank you again to the Shridath Ramphal Center, University of West Indies, the US Embassy in Barbados, and of course the Caribbean Policy Consortium for the invitation. It's following up Ambassador Edmunds and David and Patrick Duddy and Steve Lande. I could just end by just saying I agree with everything, and really keep to my time limit as part of the presentation. But let me just go ahead and add a few additional thoughts to round out this conversation. I'll just begin by noting that how interconnected, we've been speaking about this, but how interconnected the United States and the Caribbean are. It's really hard to speak of one without the other. And you mentioned the creation of the Caribbean Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. Well, we did that because I saw a need to really further elevate the importance of the Caribbean here in Washington, and to further elevate the importance of stronger US Caribbean ties, and see how we can advance that through a global institution, given the many ideas, lessons learned, best practices, the opportunities in the Caribbean that are relevant for the United States, but are relevant in the broader global community as well. And there are many challenges that we share, the Caribbean, the United States, and the world right now. Climate change, of course, pandemic, issues of migration, transnational crime, others that are really kind of global issues that are part of shared challenges with the United States and Caribbean, and their economic linkages are many fronts. Of course, one is the vibrant US-based Caribbean diaspora that are highly concentrated in a number of key cities. It's a diaspora that is a draw for many Caribbean citizens who frequently travel to the United States to visit family, stay for extended periods of time. They're critical for boosting revenue of local hotels, restaurants, shops. So as we think about economic linkages, I'll move now to trade and investment, but there's also those economic linkages insofar as the travel and the Caribbean diaspora here in the United States. The shared linkages within trade and investment, as we've been talking about throughout this conversation, are and could be even more profound. High demand for U.S. manufactured goods in the region, As guests know, the entire Pan-Caribbean region market about 27 million people, who as of a couple of years ago imported over $20 billion in goods. And it really means kind of when you look from a broader Western hemisphere level, positioning the Caribbean in that broader context, it means that it situates the region only behind Mexico and Brazil in that regard. So CARICOM countries, individual small markets, and population sizes, but still this high demand for U.S. goods, especially as part of a larger region. And also important to note the connections, local businesses, large retailers in the Caribbean, they regularly source products and goods from the United States, especially from South Florida. As we were doing work this past year on raising the importance of greater U.S. vaccine donations to the Caribbean, we raised the importance of what that means for the pivotal state of Florida. Because the Caribbean represents a third of all trade with Florida. And so by helping the Caribbean, you're also, frankly, with vaccine donations, you're also helping the economy, whether it's through tourism or whether it's the trade in the United States. And this creates more linkages between the United States and the Caribbean. We saw this during the height of the pandemic. We saw how connected Miami, for example, is the Caribbean, that Florida's economic recovery really also required more growth, more prosperity, and will require such growth and prosperity from the Caribbean as well. As well as beyond trade, U.S. investment in the Caribbean is rising, and it's incredibly wanted and needed. New future oil producers in Guyana, Suriname are sure to see upticks in U.S. investment. Not only major U.S. oil companies, but also as oil economies continue to grow, there will also be opportunities to invest in additional infrastructure and other opportunities for U.S. business. And larger economies as well, Jamaica, Trinidad, for example, are also likely to attract more investment as they also begin a transition to renewable energy, upgrading of digital infrastructure, which is, of course, also a focus of the United States in a larger regional sense on the digital front because of the engagement of Chinese firms in these spaces. And so this puts digital architecture really front and center as part of broader geopolitical issues that are of interest to the United States. And even the Eastern Caribbean is also attractive to U.S. companies. As a tourism hub, U.S. cruise companies are interested in seeing further development in OECS countries, especially as it relates to building climate resilient infrastructure. When hurricanes hit, U.S. cruise lines also miss out on potential revenue, although the effects, of course, are more devastating on the Caribbean people. It shows, again, the importance of the ties to the U.S. and U.S. business. And there's increasing interest, and we need to figure out how we're better promoting that interest in the United States to continue trading and investing in the region. A number of speakers on this call do just that every day. I'm looking at David in particular. But there's one reason why the U.S. government has used the Development Finance Corporation in recent years to advance opportunities. But one of the things that's been discussed thus far on this panel as well is that much more opportunities could exist with the Development Finance Corporation. And those opportunities could come both through expanding the mandate of the types of projects that the DFC could finance, projects that are more about kind of 21st century infrastructure, and also expanding the mandate of the number of countries that qualify for DFC financing. And that has to do with redefining some of the original mandate of the BUILD Act that established the DFC, which based on the Gini coefficient means that there are a number of countries that can't qualify for that financing. The interest in further trade and investment also, of course, has direct implications for U.S.-Caribbean relations. And this is also seen in comparison with Caribbean relations with China, which is, of course, something that gets a lot of interest increasingly here in Washington. This is what we've seen is China-Caribbean relations oftentimes being focused a lot of times on concessional financing for big infrastructure projects. And this is changed slightly due to the pandemic, allowing for health to become another avenue of engagement. But still, relative to the United States, Caribbean-China relations are more narrow, and there is actually much more opportunity for the U.S. to expand its relationship even further in a broader swath of topics with the Caribbean. Due to existing agreements, prior cooperation, health, security, energy, others, U.S.-Caribbean cooperation at the end has been relatively effective during the pandemic. Well, vaccines from the U.S. were delayed, but we also did have early COVID aid. We had early provision of PPE, technical training, mechanical equipment that was quickly donated to the region. And so what this means is that, of course, U.S. trade investment, it's incredibly important for the relationship. And also there is and could be much greater opportunities, but those linkages can be further galvanized. And there are incredible opportunities for making sure that the Caribbean policymaking is not relegated to the outskirts of U.S. foreign policy. This is important. We've been talking about this as part of this discussion. I mean, globally, regionally, there are crises everywhere. Democratic backsliding is a concern around the world. Of course, President Biden had his Summit for Democracy last week in response to that. Economic recovery is constantly threatened by new COVID variants. The Caribbean in particular has been hard hit by of course, the pullback in tourism, which needs to be a focus of how the U.S. can be more supportive of the U.S. of the Caribbean and recovering quickly the tourism economy. But one of the points that Stephen makes in his very good paper is the importance of policy on the Caribbean also coming from the White House. It gives policy more legitimacy, and it can also help to galvanize support across government. Patrick showed the slide of all the different agencies that could be involved. I think Patrick also made the point of the importance of the White House and really pushing policy forward. And to extend this is in this first less than year in office of the Biden administration, to extend this is already happening. There are NSC meetings with CARICOM ambassadors, which Ambassador Edmunds can speak more to than I certainly could. But also we see VP Harris's conversations with Caribbean leaders, which they're good examples of the Biden administration trying to carve out a different path with regard to U.S. policy in the Caribbean. But what we've also seen is that although there have been a number of meetings, the meetings have yet to translate into policy action. They've yet to translate into something specific, concrete, that really is mutually beneficial, that benefits Caribbean interests and U.S. interests and finds that middle ground. So wonderful to have meetings, but even more important to have those meetings translate into action. Of course, we are less than a year into office, but I think it's important to highlight that. I think the stage is set for big policy ideas to come out. I mentioned the meetings with the vice president. There have been several U.S. agencies, officials who have traveled to the Caribbean recently, discussed issues critical to the region and to its people, including from State Department. Admiral Fowler, before he retired from Southern Command, visited Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados on the same day that the region received U.S. donated vaccines. That's all important. But as Ambassador Edmunds also noted, congressional engagement is fundamental, and it is key, and bipartisan congressional engagement is fundamental. And that's really important for long-term action. Administrations will change every 4 or 8 years. Senators serve at least 6 years and usually many more terms than just that. And so working with Congress on a bipartisan basis and bringing together that recognition of the importance of the Caribbean, I think is fundamental. There are some champions in Congress, but I think it's really going to be important, especially going back to Stephen, your paper, as we think about this idea of a CBI 2.0, is how do we bring on these additional champions, both for trade and investment, but also champions for the relationship writ large. I think that
Jason, just to give you 1 minute to wind up.
Sure. Well, I'm winding up with 2 questions. And I think what is important is that the humility shown by the administration, its officials it's fundamental to promoting US Caribbean policy that's effective for all. And I'll end on the question of really, can the US and the Caribbean find common ground on concrete policy actions? And what more is needed to be able to find that common ground for concrete actions? And I think this was raised as well, does the political will and appetite exist to do what's needed to benefit from existing US agreements and also make the hard choices to advance a new one? So I'll end with those two questions, and thank you for allowing me to run a minute over here.
Thank you so much, Jason. And we have a lot in the chat. I'm going to propose a slight alteration to what the original agenda was. We had said we would do a little bit of a tete-a-tete among the panelists, but because we only have 15 minutes to the end, and I really want us to engage with some of the questions, what I will do is just raise some of the things that I see in the chat, and then I'm going to hand over to David to, in the last 10 minutes, kind of bring the discussion to a close and engage the panel on any of the really pivotal things, remembering that we're trying to move forward with the agenda. So many wonderful ideas. What's the next step? And one of the two of the things in the chat that have really stood out for me was, and I'll start with the last, which is a comment by Kusha Haraksin about some of the work that has been done with sugar and with the Sugar Association of the Caribbean in terms of preferential access to the US, which brings to mind maybe, instead of waiting for the political arm to do stuff, the private sector taking the lead in some of this discussion, which might be not necessarily how we have it envisaged, but it may be the way to jumpstart the discussion. So that's one thing. I see also, yes, I will look at the questions and answers tab as well, but also a comment made by Elizabeth Morgan about looking inward and what are the actual entities within CARICOM we need to start with. So if we are going to have a position at the political levels, why not a joint effort, for instance, between COFCOR and COTED? These are two of the organs of CARICOM responsible for foreign relations as well as trade and development. So why not have that kind of combining of mandates to push forward the agenda? We have an entity responsible and working in lockstep to promote the agenda. We have also certain discussions about how do we expand this beyond just CARICOM to some of the French Antilles. This is a CARICOM US discussion, but always having in mind the broader Caribbean set of countries that also we work very closely with. So also, and the French Antilles are of course members of the OECS, so also bearing that dynamic in mind. I see also some questions about why not speak more about the creative economy and the services, and that really gels nicely with some of the new thinking about how do we expand the CBI, which brings me to the Q&A segment. And I know I'll start with, again, Andrea, you were at the last question talking about whether it would be useful to think of having a service-focused bilateral agreement instead of maybe putting this whole thing as part of a larger machinery. Why not have a more focused services agreement that will really take forward some of the advanced discussions on services, which is the predominant sector in our countries and in CARICOM generally. And then finally, I wanted to also talk about the lobbyists. There's a question there about greater use of lobbyists to engage with all of these entities. I've heard the White House, I've heard Congress, I've heard Development Corporation, I've heard USAID, USTR. It's mind-blowing to think of how to navigate across all of these agencies, and we haven't even brought in the NGOs and the think tanks. So is it that we need more specialized focus by lobbyists that can work their magic in Washington and beyond? And I think obviously I will be missing some, but these are just some of the things that I wanted to ventilate. And in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to hand over to you, David, to take the conversation with the panelists forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve, and thank you, all of you. I'm just going to do a quick 2-minute warning to add some points and then pass it on to each one of you, Jason, Patrick, Ambassador Edmunds, and Stephen, just for your wrap-ups. Clearly on target, many of these issues and the discussions. I think that really the opportunity now is on these action deliverable initiatives, which means where do we have low-hanging fruit that can build on what's established, what we have in terms of the toolkit, and where are there initiatives. I've mentioned the services opportunities, which are growing in many countries in the region, and are linked now to various initiatives, not only from the US government, but regional and international. We have the IDB is now involved supporting countries in new initiatives on services, investment, and export across the region. The technology sector, the ICT BPO sector, Jamaica, Bahamas are turning into logistics shipping hubs, which is a service. I remind people it's not a good, not to mention, as many of you have pointed out already, the energy growth in the region. Energy is a service, it is not a good. And the region is becoming a center for energy services, not only in terms of exploration, as in Guyana and Suriname, but now technology services, downstream services in energy, as per the mature energy partner in the region, Trinidad and Tobago, which has been in oil and gas for over 100 years. And in terms of that, I don't think that the tools require a new policy venture, a new agreement, a new negotiation of something in services, because precisely, and we'll discuss this in a future webinar, but the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement and the Trade and Investment Council provides all the tools for that. And other countries have used them successfully. There's no reason CARICOM cannot. The last meeting of the TIC, I remind everybody, was in 2019. Unfortunately, because of COVID, it has not gone forth. There is a rumor in Washington for the past months that a new TIC will take place in 2022. I would just advocate all of us, government, private sector, think tanks, to really push that that does take place, because it's established. Nothing new has to be set, just a calendarization. And the key issue on that is the CARICOM US TIC remains the one and only of 50-something TICs that does not include the participation of the private sector. And if we don't bring in the private sector for that dialogue, you're not going to get the leverage that we've been talking about in trade and investment in these areas. I know there's nuances politically about that. It doesn't mean they come in as stakeholders to run the show. No, it means they come in for a 45-minute session out of 6 hours to discuss trade and investment. In addition to the new team at the CARICOM Secretariat, we now have a new Caribbean private sector organization in the CARICOM region, bringing together all the main players of business across the islands. We need to bring them into the fold of these discussions, as well as many of the non-governmental groups that have been discussed, think tanks, civil society organizations, media. And I'm glad that Jason mentioned the states, because that's a pet peeve. United States states have a total of 98 offices across the world promoting business for their state, regardless of what the US Embassy does. And we need to go beyond the traditional New York, Northeast, Florida. The fastest growing state in the union over the past decade is Louisiana, obviously post-Katrina growth, but the Carolinas, the Georgias, these are states that are growing fast, have a lot of linkages with the Caribbean, but are not being maximized in terms of that. And in addition to the CARICOM Secretariat, of course, the CARICOM Caucus of Ambassadors here in Washington, which at the end of the day, as Ambassador mentions, if they take their lead, if they are on the ground here, they do take their lead from capitals, but they are on the ground here. Quickly on those successes, I count CBI as a success, and it still is a success. We had success with sugar, not only in the US, but also in the EU, and that involved lobbying. A failure was bananas, and Ambassador Richard Bernal has written an excellent book on why that was a failure in terms of trade and investment, and something that can be worked on. And certainly, and Ambassador Edmunds can attest to that because he worked on it closely, everything having to do with the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative and everything having to do with the resilience initiatives in the environment during the 1990s and 2000s are success stories. We just need to focus on 2, 3, 4 items, not 27, because that's going to take into various more generations. 2, 3, 4 items that can go forth. So let me end there and then pass on to each one. Ambassador Duddy, if you'd like to start us off, and then we'll go Ambassador Edmunds, Jason, and close off with Stephen. Is that good, Genevieve?
That sounds good. I know we only have 5 minutes and it's such an interesting discussion. So I'm going to allow us to go an extra 5 because I really want the panelists to give their thoughts before we close off. So Ambassador Duddy, you can start.
Thank you very much. There have been some terrific comments made. I'm particularly struck by Ambassador Edmunds' emphasis on the importance of engaging Congress. I would like to just return to 1 or 2 other points. I think that that it is not yet clear to many in the U.S. in either the executive branch or the government what CARICOM's priorities are, economically speaking, and I think it would be extraordinarily useful for there to be an articulation of both the region's goals and priorities in both parts of that. That is to say, if you're going to go knocking on doors in Washington, if you want to become the drivers of an expansion or a deepening of the relationship, then it's got to be clear what the organization wants, acknowledging that there are dramatic differences between and among the countries of CARICOM. So I would note that. I would, on the issue of lobbyists, I don't know that you necessarily need a lobbyist or multiple lobbyists, but I do think it is important to understand, for instance, coming back to the slides that I put up there, that while the Department of State has a particular role, say the U.S. Trade and Development Agency has another and a distinct role, distinct from both USAID and the State Department or from the International Finance Corporation. Understanding those differences and understanding that each of those agencies have their own way to spell success will also be important for advancing the region's agenda. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Ambassador Edmunds, and then we can go to Jason and we'll ask Stephen to end it.
Thank you. I want to restate what Ambassador Duddy said, which is really and truly, I use the word a singular focus by CARICOM. At least there may be tendrils that fall down, but there has to be this umbrella focus that the region indicates. More importantly is the second statement, at least to me, is understand who you're meeting with and why you're meeting with them. We do have a tendency to go to the State Department and believe that that is the entity. It is the primary entity through which you're supposed to engage, but there has to be this understanding of the other agencies, and there has to be the understanding of the limitations of the State Department, for example. It's a coordinating entity as it relates to these kinds of engagements. And if we fail to do that, we're setting ourselves up for failure. Two questions. The issue of lobbyists. I was never a lobbyist, but I have advised others in the past. But one of the things that my father told me way back when was that in speaking to a then Prime Minister about hiring a lobbyist, the Prime Minister's response is, "That's why I have you there." So the fundamentals are us as representatives of the region are only going to be as good and as effective as our understanding of Washington and everything else and how Washington operates. And I think it may very well serve some of us to have a primer in terms of how Washington works so that we can effectively plug in. And last point on the private sector as the driver, I think we're all in agreement that the private sector, the regional private sector has to engage. But in my experience, one of the unfortunate realities is, and this is sort of dealing in the hospitality industry and others, is that the private sector, for the most part, still look back to the government and still look back to the government to lead. And we need to basically recognize that maybe our private sector is not as strong as we think they are. And maybe our private sector, in as much as people like to claim the private sector is more sophisticated than government, maybe the private sector is not as sophisticated as government. as it relates to engaging governments on the outside. So there has to be this balance created between these two entities. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Over to you, Jason.
Gosh, it's hard to follow Ambassador Edmunds there and Patrick, but I'll just end by saying, you know, some of the greatest and most successful U.S. relationships across this hemisphere and across the world is when they're tied back to U.S. interests, right? In the end, you're going to get more consistent attention, more consistent focus when there is that focus on U.S. interests. And I think of a few countries in the hemisphere where that has happened, and also finding that common ground with our partners' interests, right? Because relationships are all about two-way streets. So I think that's fundamental. And I also, you know, when I was speaking earlier, I mentioned China a couple of times. I think that we have to show the importance of that relationship beyond just global geostrategic issues. You know, China ends up being a focus, maybe too much of a focus sometimes, but we need to identify what are those other areas of why the Caribbean must be consistently a focal point for not only State Department, but also other agencies and for the Congress. Just wanting to help and be a you know, benevolent partner when there's so many competing global priorities means that things will fall to the wayside. And so and there are so many reasons why the Caribbean and that a strong U.S. Caribbean relationship is so strategically important for the United States. And so I think raising that, and I think that also goes back to then this point about congressional engagement and engaging members of Congress. Of course, those who have Caribbean constituencies are interested in the Caribbean, but how do you broaden the tent of members of Congress who recognize the importance of the Caribbean beyond just those those who already envision that currently. So I'll end with that point.
Wonderful. Stephen, over to you to close off the discussion.
Well, I'm not going to say what I'm supposed to say was, what a great discussion. I was very disappointed with the discussion because the problem the Caribbean faces, true of many other groups, are you end up putting 25 different ideas on the table instead of focusing on one. You leave, you say, oh, boy, everybody agree, we move on. We got some very basic problems with the Caribbean. I put on one idea, not necessarily the right idea, very easy. You cannot expect countries the size of the Caribbean, divided Caribbean, to be able to get a policy through, working through, there's a group, Prosper Africa, that organizes all the groups. So instead of the 7 or 8 agencies that Ambassador Duddy had, this one has 15, 16, something called Prosper Africa. You don't do anything. You go to some low-level official, you tell them what your interests are, and maybe if it's something special, it may get up to the top. You talk about services. Services is not an industry which is mainly determined by government. It's determined mainly by free people going and working in different areas. There are regulations there. So all I was saying, and I'm just going to reiterate it because I don't want it to be lost, is no, throw out the old model. Nothing has happened in this region since CBI that is noteworthy. You talked about your initiatives, the Caribbean Basin or the Caribbean Act of 2016, 2020. It went nowhere. You ended up with a list of 20 things. State Department did a great job. Not one concrete result did I see. It may exist, and so on. So now you have an access to the president. You have something called democracy. I agree 100% with the point that Jason made, and so on. You need shared value, to quote Mr. Biden, and shared challenges. I agree about China. We don't have to fight China. The U.S. just has to have an effective regime in China. You have that open to you. Use it. Go to the people who organize the democracy people, because they're the ones who talk to the president. Say, we want an initiative. Decide your initiative. What I was saying was not to go to CARICOM groups, but to use your group, Dr. Remy, and get other experts and put together a plan. not necessarily like we did during the Reagan administration, where they came out of the administration and we made a horrible mistake by only focusing on trade and trade in goods, trade in agriculture were not the right way to go and so on. So again, my final conclusion is to simply say, if you like the idea of trying to work on an initiative, focusing on a deadline of next year when they're going to have the next summit, work now, start in the private sector, put together what you want in this initiative, focus on those measures where the governments can help you and so on, focus on how you have access to the money that's now floating around for these processes and so on. But please don't start with 50 other ideas, because you'll be exactly where you have been before. My comment was the best papers that I read in terms of preparing for this wasn't the 25, 40-page documents that seemed to come out of the Caribbean, were by articles, I think, by Miss Morgan, which was short and to the point, that appeared in the newspaper. George Foriel's article was like 4 or 5 pages, right to the point. Please focus on your strength. And the strength now is go to the White House with ideas and let the ideas come out of the private sector, because CARICOM, for the reasons cited above, may not be able to make them. Sorry for being so frank, but I'm an obnoxious New Yorker, so I apologize. But as I tell David Lewis, we have a good partnership because he's an obnoxious Puerto Rican, so we get together very well. I wish we were as genteel as my friends are in CARICOM. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And I'll just say it's difficult to close this session off. I love the candor. I love the ideas, but I agree with you that we do need to channel them. I'm not disappointed at the discussion. I thought we had some kernels there of excellent perspectives that we can really use to rally the region. And I know there were some concrete, solid things that came out, joint initiatives for COFCOR and COTED, thinking more strategically about how we engage Congress, using the CBI and the TIC as platforms. And it does take think tanks, Jason, you and I, to really CPC, to really see how we can take all of these ideas and put forward some concrete suggestions that the private sector and CARICOM and our heads of states and our entities can use to take the plans forward. So we've done, I think, the beginning of that work, and we look forward next year to doing more of that work. All that leaves for me to do is to thank the panelists. The paper by Stephen Lande, as I mentioned, will be available on our website, shridathramphalcenter.com. I want to thank the speakers, Ambassador Duddy, Ambassador Edmunds, Mr. Jason Marczak, as well, for their thoughtful, insightful, and provocative comments. I want to thank my co-collaborator, the US Embassy, as well as the thinking of CPC as represented by David in putting together this first webinar and thinking through of how we're going to execute the remaining 2 webinars, which will deal more concretely with the TIC as a tool, as well as really working towards engaging the private sector and taking some of the lessons from others in the region that have done it more successfully than we have. So on our behalf, let me thank you, the audience, for joining us. You have been wonderful this year. We look forward to having more of these sessions with you and learning and improving for next year, so we come back fighting as a fighting force in 2020. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful season. Goodbye, everyone, and see you again next year.